The activists that I've spoken to, the MPs I've spoken to, just have their heads in their hands. They get despairing messages from advisors. This is the kind of thing that's so easy to get right. Getting it wrong is extraordinary.
Frankly, this date was in the diary for 8 decades. This day should have been penciled out in any Prime Minister's diary, back in 1944.
In the end, he's not a toddler. He's the Prime Minister. And there are things that Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom are supposed to do.
If there's a poll in the next few days that shows Reform and the Conservatives neck and neck, effectively, will that be the moment people really start to panic? Hello, we've scrambled to bring you a special political forecast because there are moments in an election that come to define the loser, and we might just have seen the one for 2024. I'm talking about something on the level of Gordon Brown's bigoted woman hot mic disaster, that picture of Ed Miliband chewing on a bacon sandwich, Theresa May crying nothing has changed after U-turning on her manifesto. The fury over Rishi Sunak leaving the D-Day commemorations early to go and do a TV interview had already reached fever pitch by the time he apologised at 7:45 a.m. Why would he do it? Having spent the campaign so far reaching out to the very voters who hold respect for history and veterans so dear. Why did his team plan it? Why did David Cameron, who posed in his place for the photos, not tell him this was a mistake? So, is this the moment the game is up and closing the gap on Labour becomes unrecoverable? Nigel Farage is already out there saying it shows Sunak isn't patriotic. With me, Conservative Home's Henry Hill, Boris Johnson's former Director of Communications, Guto Harri, and Labour's Jonathan Ashworth. Henry, people are angry.
Yeah, the entire party was angry with Rishi Sunak anyway. They were angry at being ambushed with a general election when they weren't ready and the party wasn't ready. They've been angered by CCHQ, that's Conservative Campaign Headquarters, manifestly not being ready to give them the literature they need. They've been angry about the way that they've conducted the campaign. And now they are out there knocking on doors and they're being asked the question, Britain in World War II, like yes or no, right? That's something that is normally fairly easy to be on the right side of as a question. So, of course, the Conservative Party, the activists that I've spoken to, the MPs I've spoken to, just have their heads in their hands. They get despairing messages from advisors. This is the kind of thing that's so easy to get right that you don't get credit for getting it right. Getting it wrong is extraordinary.
I mean, as soon as you saw the photo last night of David Cameron there instead of Rishi Sunak, you could go, why did nobody think about this? And is that what you think happened? Nobody thought about it? Or was it deliberate?
I don't know in this specific instance exactly what happened, but I think a problem that Rishi Sunak's Downing Street had was that it was a real bunker and they kept just doing things inside it without consulting across government, without taking advice. His 3 big conference policies were all cooked up without consultation with the departments. So, my favourite example, he announced the abolition of T-levels in T-levels week. He hadn't told the T-levels minister, who then had to go and do the rest of the T-levels week media round talking about how great they were. And then here, someone should have mentioned it. I mean, his excuse was even worse because he came out and said this was booked weeks ago. It's like, okay, well, that means that someone in your media grid booked an ITV interview over D-Day and no one flagged it. And then, David Cameron should have told it to. So if no one else, because I can understand junior advisors maybe didn't feel able to tell him. David Cameron should have had the confidence to say, this is an insane decision, stay where you are.
Guto, I mean, you've been on the inside of these things. I mean, can you understand how this happened?
I can understand how it happens. Doesn't mean that I think it wasn't a disaster. It was, it was a massive dropping of a very, very big ball, and it could be a seminal moment without cutting to that chase. All I would say in terms of explanation, I feel awkward sort of criticising people there because they wrestle with difficult decisions all the time, and there are always media demands on a prime minister. And if you say no to them, and you've probably done this to me, you say, so your man is running scared of the press, your man fears scrutiny, your man doesn't want to talk to our audience. All that is very, very powerful. And of the different people in the room, some want him to see donors, some want him to be on the doorstep, some want him to come and talk to you. Not very many in Conservative HQ, to be honest with you. And so they're competing demands. But in the end, the Prime Minister's got to say, but this is a no-brainer. And this is one of those occasions where, despite all those calls where you are between a rock and a hard place, and there are lots of those, this was a no-brainer. And frankly, this date was in the diary for 8 decades. This day should have been penciled out in any prime minister's diary, back in 1944. And that's why it grates, and that's why it's very, very damaging.
And do you think this is that moment, the Gillian Duffy moment, the sort of the moment that people it'll come to be emblematic of Rishi Sunak's campaign?
So, and I may be clutching at straws here, but I'm trying to be honest with you. I think it's different in some ways, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. But Gillian Duffy was an example of a prime minister really showing, in his own words, contempt for members of his own party. I don't think anyone out there genuinely thinks that Rishi Sunak wanted to snub the veterans, that had Rishi Sunak realised the implications of this, that he would have taken that decision, that this was a mess up somewhere in the system, and there are massive flaws in the system, clearly, for this to have happened. But I don't think, on reflection, people will think this guy doesn't get what modern Britain's about. He's not patriotic. He doesn't care about veterans. And that, I think, hopefully for his sake, means he's got some collateral in the bank. Whereas with Gordon Brown, it did look like, he thought that the average person who supported Labour, heart and soul, was scum.
Jonathan, I mean, you were there, you were working for Gordon Brown in 2010 when that bigoted moment, hot mic moment happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you'll disagree with Guto's sort of portrayal of it, but I mean, when you're in the campaign's not going very well, as it wasn't then, and then the boss does something like that, how does it feel when you're inside of that campaign? I mean, it must be terrible.
Oh, yes, it is. It's hugely demoralising. And I suspect in the Tory campaign today, there will be people who are on the floor because they're utterly demoralised. They might not yet be talking to journalists, but they will be beginning to blame one another. Yeah. What is going on? So-and-so should have looked at this, so-and-so should have looked at that. All of that would be going on. But I do think, though, look, to sort of describe this as I know nobody on the panel has, but some of the media have just been doing interviews, have said, it's a gaffe, it's a misstep. I think there's something more fundamental than that. I think it does go to the heart of Rishi Sunak's judgment. It does go to his character, because in the end, he's not a toddler. He's the Prime Minister. And there are things that Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom are supposed to do. They're supposed to turn up at the cenotaph and look smart and decent and respectful, because everybody knows what happened to Michael Foot 40 years ago. Well, he wasn't the Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, but you see the point I'm making. There are events that Prime Ministers are supposed to do and have to do it well. It's part of the job description.
But when you say it's about his character, I mean, it doesn't make him a bad man, does it?
Why
It
was
out of touch?
It makes him out of touch, and an alarm bell should have been going off in his head about staying at this event, particularly when he would have been told that there was an opportunity to be there with the other nations who were such a central part of what was happened 80 years ago. I cannot, for the life of me, understand why he chose to leave early. And if it's because he's decided he wanted to do a sort of ITV interview to try and score political points in this campaign, I think in the end people are now probably asking themselves, I slightly disagree with you in a comradely way. I think people are going to be asking themselves, what sort of individual thinks it's more important to rush away and do that type of interview and not stay for the whole event? I think it's a very significant moment.
In an equally comradely way, I don't think any of us should describe going off to do an ITV interview as seizing the opportunity to score points. I mean, most politicians have got to be dragged kicking and screaming to an ITV studio to face the kind of interrogation they can expect from, someone like you or any of your colleagues upstairs. So I think that's a cheap shot, to be honest. And this is not a time to be cheap, because it's been a major judgment of error. But I don't think he thought, great, I can go and talk to a journalist. Had he turned down ITV, he would have been accused of running scared.
No, not on this. Honestly, he wouldn't. He could have done the ITV interview today.
Apparently Downing Street chose the days. They were the ones, because that's what happens. You ask when will you do an interview, and then Downing Street come to you and say,
and you look at those tiny windows where you could do it.
Come off it.
I mean, the honest thing is, it should have been glaringly obvious to anyone in number 10, and I don't want to sound crude about this or vulgar, but they'd have thought the best possible thing, even in a selfish way, not to mention that it was the right thing to do morally, that it was the right thing to do to play your part as a statesman, it was the right thing to do to represent all of us who are not invited out there, was to be there. But even on a selfish level, the right thing to do in terms of general election campaigning was to not campaign yesterday and just to be there all day looking like a statesman.
But both you and I will have sat in number 10 grid meetings in our time, and I just do not get the process that they would have gone through. Why did someone not say, hang on a minute, are you really saying he's going to come back early from the event, not do the event with President Biden? We'll send David Cameron, especially when there's all the stuff around how David Cameron looks more like a leader on the world stage anyway. I mean, I just don't get it. You've been in those meetings. You've both been in those meetings.
I can only imagine. So I offer this as an imagine that what happened was said, of course, Prime Minister, you're going to be at the big gig. You're going to be at the service. That is the solemn occasion where we remember the dead. You're also going to do stuff for a bit. And then the dinner with Macron and Schultz,
don't worry
forget
about
that.
it. Yeah.
And that's what would have happened, to be fair.
Henry, I mean, lots of fun being had around this, sort of it's great talking point, but isn't it more serious than that as well? In that we're talking about D-Day, we're talking about veterans. There's sort of a lack of emotional intelligence around the impact of that kind of insult, which is how many people are seeing it. And that's the kind of the alarming thing when it comes to sort of how people will judge Rishi Sunak. They'll say, it's not that he's an idiot or a bad man. It's just that he doesn't get it. And that's the really dangerous thing.
Yeah, it could, because as you say, no one's walked away from this thinking that Rishi Sunak hates the veterans or thinks D-Day was a waste of time or anything like that. But it speaks to judgment. And I think in fairness, especially for a lot of Conservatives, this is a concern that many of them have had, because Rishi became incredibly popular as Chancellor during the pandemic when he had a license to hose money at the country without asking them to pay for it, which is an easy way to get very popular as a politician. But even back then, if you looked at instances where he actually had to use his own political judgment, it wasn't amazing. And this is almost encapsulates that. And I think that rather than, we've been talking about what the impact of this will be. And, if this was a close election and the Tories and Labour at 30%, I think the impact would be bigger. In absolute terms, the impact of any scandal is less when you're down at your core vote.
You think it's over anyway?
Yeah, anything could happen, but they're not going to close 20 points, right? It could get better.
But could this help the core vote go to Nigel Farage?
It could help some of the core vote go to Nigel Farage, and I think it's the kind of thing that it serves as a shorthand for why somebody turns away from a politician or a party. If there's lots of other things that maybe they've had doubts about or they're upset about, this is the kind of thing that sums it all up for people. He's the Prime Minister who left the D-Day commemorations. That's the real danger.
If there's a poll in the next few days, Guto, that shows Reform and the Conservatives neck and neck, effectively, will that be the moment people really start to panic?
No, I've always been really hardcore on this. Reform are out there on the fringes of British politics where they belong. And the focus of every Conservative who takes pride in being one of the most successful election-winning forces in the history of democracy globally should be on the sweet spot in the centre of British politics where elections are won and lost. So forget Reform. The idea that Nigel Farage somehow is the ultimate example of, great British patriotism is laughable. Penny Mordaunt will be, debating on behalf of the Conservatives tonight. Proud military family, naval family. She served herself as a volunteer. There's plenty of people in Conservative ranks, and to be fair, these days, on your benches, who can do that.
But you've always been a centrist,
not offering that.
And the party is not there.
Well, Reform is not the place to go. And I think it was a significant moment, to be fair, when Keir Starmer surrounded himself with a bunch of people who had served their country, unlike Nigel Farage, backing him. I think that's a moment. But there are plenty of Conservatives in that place as well, and they will be mortified that this had happened. But again, it's because we have a clean-living, hard-working, super bright, but geeky Prime Minister. And after the man that I worked for, that seemed to be what the appetite was for. So we have a choice between two rather dull, technocratic people, neither of whom inspires anyone particularly. And the choice is a hard-headed one, almost like a headhunter. Which man is best placed to sort of take Britain to the end of the decade? And I still think Rishi does a better job there than Keir.
Jonathan,
Could I just ask you a question, a genuine question?
Yeah.
I interacted with Boris Johnson in the pandemic when I was the Shadow Health Secretary. I went into Downing Street and had a meeting with him to essentially give him Labour's support for lockdown. That's basically what it was. So, but other than those discussions, I've never really had much interaction with Boris Johnson. What would Boris Johnson have done if he'd spotted his diary like this? Would he have said, we've got to stay for the whole thing?
I bet that's on your list of questions as well. So I have had friends saying if you, Guto, and Boris were still there, you'd have actually, landed on the beach in some sort of ancient craft with a bunch of people who were there at the time, sort of showing him where exactly it would have happened. Or he would have, dropped out of a Chinook or whatever. So he would have certainly captured the moment. And the moment would have resonated deeply for him as a man with a great sense of history and all that. And no doubt he will write something about all of this in the very near future that will be very, very resonant. And people will think, wow, was he that bad after all? But parking all of that, I think you're right. He has that sense of occasion. And actually, everyone should. And you pose a good question, Christian. Why did get David Cameron, who is quite sure-footed on those looking the part, sounding the part, playing the part? He was quite sure-footed in that. Why didn't he say, do you know what, Prime Minister, much as I'd like to be there, this really is one where it's not for the understudy.
Maybe he was thinking, this will be a good chapter in the book.
Well,
he's still just got time to stand for a seat.
Yeah.
I mean, how does Labour play this now, though? Because, again, thinking back to Gillian Duffy, the Conservatives didn't have to go on about it because it did so much damage by itself. Is this the same sort of thing that you don't need to talk about this, do you? Because it plays its own story.
Well, look, you're asking me to sort of, ask if there's a sort of tactical thing here.
Because there are debates over the next few days. I'm wondering how Labour will play it.
Look, I think in the end, we strongly believe it does reveal something about Rishi Sunak's judgment and character. We think in the end it reveals that he wanted to get away. He wanted to do this political interview, suggests he's putting party ahead of country. But look, you just have to listen to one of the radio phone-ins today. The amount of outrage from people on this. I think the voices of the British people will be heard far louder than the voices of Labour politicians in the studios in the next few days.
And what did you think of his "let's not politicise this"? Because this is about D-Day veterans.
But he was the guy who returned yesterday to do an interview to repeat what we think are lies about Labour's tax and spend plans.
Same question about Nigel Farage to you, really, which is, he's out there already saying this shows the Conservative Party is now led by a man who is not patriotic. And he will probably pick up some votes over this particular instance. That helps the Labour Party get a bigger majority. Is it a bad thing that's happening?
No. Look, I'll leave all the John Curtises of the world to do all the cephology and the electoral arithmetic analysis. What I would say, though, more broadly, is that we had a lot of smarty pants briefing from Rishi Sunak's crowd that they was going to spend the first 2 weeks of this campaign putting reform in its box and then turning their sort of guns onto Labour. Well, what that resulted in was Nigel Farage announcing himself as a candidate. So I think that's a question for the Tory strategists as to how they appear to have got that so wrong.
How do you think this week went after the leadership debate, where Rishi Sunak clearly landed a message, whether it's true or not? It's a number that has now lodged in a lot of people's minds, and that is effective campaigning, whether it's an honourable thing to do or not. Did that do you some damage? Well,
look, we thought it was and consider it a lie, and sometimes in politics, the smarty pants special advisors or political advisors will say, never repeat your opponent's slur against you, because that just puts your opponent's attack in the forefront of people's minds. But we thought it was a lie, and we thought we had to be out there exposing it as a lie, not least because the particular thing that we considered to be quite devastating for Rishi Sunak was the way in which he claimed that his position was backed up by impartial Treasury civil servants. when we all know it's different. I mean, before I worked in Downing Street, I worked for Gordon Brown in the Treasury. We all know that it was produced effectively by Treasury special advisors. And then when the letter came out from the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury saying this, you can't present this analysis, analysis shouldn't be presented in this way, I think that exposed Rishi Sunak as lying. And again, I think what has happened today, I think compounds that. And I think there'll be a lot of doubts in voters' minds now about Rishi Sunak.
I mean, had you been up against Boris Johnson, you'd have been throwing around liar all the time. But it's a bit surprising, in a way, against Rishi Sunak, isn't it? Who's a more technocratic.
Well, I think it was surprising.
Prime Minister.
I think it was surprising the way in which he insisted until he was blue in the face that the independent Treasury had endorsed the analysis when they hadn't. And he still was doing that in his ITV interview that came out yesterday.
How do you think, where's the sort of the graph? I mean, has any advantage from the debate been cancelled out by the post-debate reaction and now this gaffe?
Oh, by this gaffe, yeah.
This gaffe wipes everything out.
Yeah, I'd have thought so. I mean, I think there are several problems with the line that Rishi was taking. It's really difficult for the Conservatives on tax because one, he was also simultaneously saying, no one knows what Labour's plan is, but also we know it will cost you exactly £2,000, which is slightly confusing. But also, even using his own maths, the Tories are hiking taxes, right? This is the problem. They're trotting out Labour's tax bombshell, which was a really, really effective campaign tool in 1992, when the Conservatives had kept taxes really low and there was a real tangible gap. But now, the pension tax that he, when he went after Starmer on the, if I don't get re-elected, pensions are going to be taxed for the first time. The reason that is because Rishi Sunak, while Chancellor, broke 40 years of cross-party consensus and froze income tax thresholds. And that tax is hitting everyone else. Now, unfortunately, Labour didn't go after him on that because I don't think Labour are going to unfreeze income tax thresholds. But the Tories don't have a good story to tell on tax. They have not cut taxes. Any headline tax cuts are wiped out by fiscal drag. So you can see why he thought he had to do something, just try and lodge a number in the public consciousness.
Guto, can you discern what the strategy is coming out of Downing Street now?
I think a lot of this is contrived on both sides, to be honest, because, if you'd gone into the last election and said we're going to spend 400 billion dealing with a war in Europe and a global pandemic, everybody would have said, well, what planet are you on, mate? But that's exactly what happened. And so I would welcome, though it's not going to happen, honesty on both sides, that the reason Conservatives put taxes up is not because the party believes in high taxes. It patently doesn't, and historically that fact is proven. But when you spend 400 billion doing something which had near universal consent for it, paying people to be at home, staying safe rather than out there at risk of death, there's a bill to be paid at some point. So Labour are being dishonest about that, but the Conservatives haven't actually explained that that's why tax has been high under them.
I suppose you'd say, well, you tried to pin the global financial crisis on us, so...
Well, I mean, if we had I mean, I would also point out that if you've had anemic growth for 10 years or so going into the pandemic, and
it's not true. Actually, we went into the pandemic in a good enough state to actually be able to spend 400 billion. Now, this is not a great thing to sort of feel
borrowing.
good
That's
about.
Different, though, isn't it? It's through borrowing. The market's expected
you wouldn't
nations
get,
to borrow.
As you know, you wouldn't get a mortgage and you wouldn't get a loan if your credit rating was low as an individual. And same goes for a government. So the government, having sorted the public finances, was well placed to go into that.
In COVID, the markets expected governments to borrow for things like furlough. That's the difference. And going into COVID, growth in the UK had been anemic and we were not in a great place compared to previous decades.
So very briefly, I mean, where do you think the campaign goes now?
Well, I mean, next week I suspect we'll see
manifestos.
I think we've got more debate. I mean, it's not a head-to-head debate, but there's the Sky debate. The two leaders are on Sky next week. So,
why is Starmer so reluctant to debate?
He's not reluctant to debate.
Well, he doesn't want to do many. He's doing two.
Well, he's debating.
Is it just when you're leaving, don't take a risk?
He's debating him, so we're gonna look. I mean, you're going to see lots of Starmer.
Back to where we started. When you don't turn up for the media, you are accused of ducking scrutiny and ducking debate. And I think you're onto something. I think Keir Starmer doesn't want to sort of risk being exposed by Rishi Sunak and by a debate and by journalists. But that's where we're stuck with at the moment.
So next few days, I mean, You don't honestly think they can pull it
I've
back,
racked
do you?
my brains thinking, how can you turn back the clock or do something that looks so deeply patriotic that it wipes out what has happened? But I think it's got to be one of those where you just say, do you know what, we can't do anything about it. We've got to leave it there and carry on, because there are still other things to fight about. We've got to glance forwards towards the rest of the decade and pose the question for people, putting them in the loneliness of the polling booth. Who do you think is best placed to lead Britain to the end of the decade?
Henry?
I mean, this has sort of come at the worst possible time, because I think it's next week that postal votes drop, which is mostly older voters. So at that point, the campaign will, I imagine, pivot towards more of the kind of voters who vote in person, younger voters, working age voters, and so on. I don't know how, though. Like, realistically, the Conservative Party is going to drop its manifesto. We'll see what's in it, see if there's anything in there to cheer up Tory candidates. But most of them that I've spoken to, they're starting to just run local campaigns. Some of them have said they're
Every man for himself.
They've said they're going to start disregarding CCHQ rules about approving literature. Like, they are just fighting their own seats.
Sounds like total chaos.
Yeah.
Henry, Guto, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.